Thank you very much. It's very good to be here in Germany. I came together with Dominik from Switzerland, so I'm a Swiss citizen, and my profession is history. I work on the topic of international relations from 1945 until today, so the last 70 years. And today I would like to work with you about this topic, war on terrorism. We're now in the year 2017, so that's 16 years that we are all together in this war on terrorism. And I very much like this moment tonight here because we're from almost 30 different nations. There's people from Singapore here, there's people from Norway, there's people from Israel, there's people from Switzerland, there's people from Germany, people from China. You know, I can't mention all of them. I've seen people speaking Spanish, others were speaking Italian, and others French. So obviously we all have a different look on this war on terrorism. And what I try to present you are my facts and figures that I found out during the last 16 years, and some will agree, some will disagree, because it's a very emotional topic. My question is 9/11, that's the terrorist attacks of 9/11. What is the so-called war on terror really? Is it a fight for oil and gas? I know that is a delicate question, it is an interesting question, I hope, and I'm just taking you on a journey. These are the main points, the take-home messages I want, to give you. First, I want to talk about global oil consumption, because if we ask ourselves, is there a fight or a struggle for oil and gas? We must first ask ourselves, well, how much oil do we need? It's 96 million barrels every day. It's a lot of oil that we need every day. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, we only used 6 million barrels. So all of us here in the room were born after 1945, so all of us are used to this increase in oil consumption. It's always there. We went from 6 to 96 million barrels per day. And to give you an impression how much oil this is, I brought this picture of a supertanker, which is really a very, very large ship. We don't have them in Switzerland. That's the first thing to say. Somebody said, oh, I've seen a supertanker going up the Rhine. And I said, no, you haven't. You really haven't. I mean, they're huge. So nobody has seen them in Switzerland. You have to leave the country to see them and travel the world. So that's 47 supertankers we need every day. And you can't say, well, next year, the year 2018, let's just try without oil and then see how it all works. It wouldn't work. Okay. The entire system is based on this critical resource. And now we've shared the day, and we were talking about water. Water, obviously, is a very, very crucial issue in the 21st century. My talk is not going to be about water at all. It's going to be about war, peace, and oil, and these connections. And to get at the oil means that we sometimes have to take big risks as a human family. It's not just one company which is taking big risks. It's really the human family which has become addicted to oil. And in 2010, we had the explosion of Deepwater Horizon. It's now already 7 years ago, but who actually recalls this incident? Maybe a show of hands. Okay, there's quite a few who still recall that we had this problem back then. The whole platform exploded. It was really a huge accident. When we look at the data, this graph is in German, but I want to show you the meters. It's 1,500 meters through the water. And then it's another 4 kilometers through the solid soil, and the oil was down here at 5.5 kilometers. So that basically shows you that in order to get at the oil, we're already taking very, very high risks. You wouldn't drill for the oil down there if there was oil easily acceptable at lower cost. You just wouldn't do that. You can also go to Canada, where you can find this sort of oil. It's called tar sand. But this is not liquid oil, okay? So here again, you need water to actually get it out of the ground. You go to Alberta, Canada, cut down the wood, and then it looks like that. And obviously, that's what we do as human beings. I don't want to criticize the Canadians. It's not about Canada, okay? It's a reflection on what we do to actually get to the petroleum that we need. And it's a very similar message to what we've heard before. we have to increase our awareness of the side effects. It's when we were talking about the water and we put all these pollutants or all the plastic into the sea, we don't think about the side effects, but they're coming back, and that's the same here. So that's the first point. We need 96 million barrels per day. MBD is just the abbreviation. And for historians, it's normal that we talk about resource wars. But the only problem is that if you read your average newspaper, you don't have this word in your newspaper. And if you watch TV, you don't have the word resource war on television. You don't have the word oil war or gas war. You just don't have it. It's not there. You can do a Google search, put in resource war, and go on news, and then just check, okay, when the term came up. And then compare that with terrorists, okay? And you'll see terrorists are all over the place. So most people think that all wars that you see are wars to fight terrorists. And they have nothing to do with oil and gas, or they have nothing to do with geostrategy. I'm trying to take these things apart because for historians it's very normal that we've been fighting for oil and gas for a long time. If you look at the British and the Americans, and again here, that's nothing to do with nationalities. All the Americans in the room and all the British in the room are exact partners of the human family, as we all are. But historically speaking, it's important to recall that Roosevelt, who was the predecessor of Trump, if you want, predecessor, the President of the United States, and Churchill, Prime Minister of United Kingdom, talked in 1944 about the oil in the Middle East. And what Roosevelt said to Churchill, think of that, it was in 44. So the Second World War was still going on. He said, the Persian oil is yours, so Iran today. And he said, the oil in Iraq and in Kuwait we share. And as far as the oil from Saudi Arabia is concerned, that is ours. So this is a clear division of markets, if you want. But obviously, these are formally independent countries, and you can't just say, okay, the oil here is mine, and what it implies is imperialism. We call this imperialism. If you try to control the resources in another country, and the British and the Americans have sort of divided the Middle East among themselves. And if you look at the area we're talking about, this is Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. That's really the green area here. And you will see, if you look at the BP data, that this is where the cheap oil can be pumped. It's obviously the same zone that has been in constant war over quite a long time. Now, what I'm interested in as a Swiss historian is I look at where does the oil come from, and it's very easy to understand it doesn't come from Switzerland. Okay, we have no oil whatsoever in Switzerland. So we have to be very attentive. We have to look, where does it come from? What are the oil wars? What is going on? And we're here in Germany today, in Cologne, and it's very easy to realize Germany has no oil whatsoever either. The Spanish, they have no oil. The French, they have no oil. People in Belgium, they have no oil. Okay, it has to come from somewhere. People in Italy, they have no oil. And what we then do is we take the graph here where you see, okay, that's the easy oil, the cheap oil, and we take a map with world religions, and we put it over it, okay? And then you will realize the following. Europe is basically Christian, and that doesn't matter whether you personally are Christian or whether you're an atheist, that doesn't matter. Just culturally speaking, the countries of Europe are in this color, so that's the Christian historical group, and North and South America is Christian, Australia and New Zealand is Christian, southern part of Africa is Christian, whereas India is a different color. This is mainly Hindu country, okay? Thailand, here is a different color, that's the Buddhist area, whereas China, which is communist, is atheist from the system. But I want to draw your attention to the green zone, and you quickly see that's the Muslim countries. So the oil is where the Muslims live. Okay, that's a simplification, but it's true. The oil, the cheap oil, is where the Muslims live. And some people in Switzerland have become so deeply immersed in this war on terrorism that they very strongly distrust the Muslim and the Islamic. They just distrust him. So I tell them, the oil is where the Muslims are. And then they say, oh, really? So the Muslims moved there, right? I say, no. They just distrust an entire religious group. I say, no, they didn't move there. They've been living there before. And we started to use oil in the year 1850. So Muslims have been living there 1,000 years before. So it's a historical coincidence, okay? But today, this so-called war on terrorism is actually hitting Muslim countries, very, very strongly. So Libya was bombed, that's here, it's a Muslim country. Iraq was bombed, it's a Muslim country. Afghanistan was bombed, it's a Muslim country. Right now, Syria is being bombed, another Muslim country. And here in Europe, we'd feel completely different about the whole war on terrorism if France was bombed, or Switzerland, or Denmark, or Germany. Okay, do you understand the perspective? I mean, this whole war on terrorism is a very, very delicate thing. But if we reflect upon it, we see that it basically is about bombing Muslim countries. And the reason given is always that we say they're evil dictators, they have weapons of mass destruction, and it has never anything to do with oil. And we start to question this. I mean, we know that, wars for resources have been going on for centuries. It's not something new. And we look at the data very closely. So resource wars, and that's the second take-home message from my side to you, is resource wars have been there for a very, very long time. They've been there before 9/11, and we think they will be there for a long time. But it's very important that we address the reality of resource wars, that they exist. If we avoid the term, that doesn't give us any clarity. And now we have the United Nations Charter, and I want to come to this in my third point. You all know that the United Nations is an organization which was being constructed in 1945 after the end of the Second World War. Now, what was the Second World War? When I teach history students, I tell them the Second World War was the biggest disaster we created as a human family, ever. That's 60 million people killed. That's the entire population of France. Just think of the amount of people that we killed there. So we must have been completely out of our minds, and we were. So at the end of the Second World War, we said, okay, let's not do this anymore. We've seen it. We can do it. We can kill each other. We can drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And, we can go to the extreme as human beings, as members of the human family. But we can also do the opposite. We can care for our children. We can clean the water. We can build up schools. And, we always have this choice. So when we set up the United Nations in 1945, we introduced this rule which said all countries which are member of the United Nations, and we now have 193 countries which are member of the United Nations, all countries stop from bombing each other. And that's a very, very sensible rule, okay? Not one country is allowed to bomb another country. Furthermore, not one country is allowed to send tanks into another country. A very, very sensible rule. Not one country is allowed to arm a group secretly in another country, which will create chaos. We're not going to do that. And these are the UN members, and you basically see the world is blue, in the sense of blue, all countries are UN members. But something is not working, we realize this. I mean, Switzerland is a member of the United Nations. Germany, where we are today, is a member of the United Nations. US is a member of the United Nations. Russia, obviously. China is a member. Afghanistan, Syria, Israel, Brazil, you name it, Belgium, any country you're from, okay? You are probably all members of the United Nations, unless you're from the Vatican. But nobody is here today from the Vatican, I think. And just very few countries which have a very special situations are not members of the United Nations. Italy, obviously, is a member of the United Nations. And the general prohibition of the use of force by states is written in the UN Charter. The UN Charter was signed in 1945, so this is international law, but we have just generally forgotten about it. What does it say? It says all members, so the members are here, everybody basically, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So it basically says all UN members, all countries of the world, shall not bomb other countries. That's it. It's a very simple rule, and people tend to say, well, but it didn't work, so let's forget about it. No, we should not forget about it. It's, for the 21st century, a very, very important sentence to guide us through difficult terrain, okay? And everybody, independent of what nation you're from, has an interest, that his nation is not being bombed. Obviously, the 193 members of the United Nations are not all equally powerful. We have 5 countries which are more powerful, and that's United States, that's Russia, that's China, that's France, and that's Great Britain, because they are so-called veto powers. So if they invade another country, they're not being punished. Usually, the UN Security Council should punish a nation if it invades another country. I give you an example. When Saddam Hussein, dictator of Iraq, invaded Kuwait in 1990, he was punished. Okay, the UN Security Council met and said, "Yeah, you can't do that. It's against this law. You can't invade another country." So he was punished. However, if the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council attack another country, they're not being punished. Why? Because they have a veto power. Okay. So, for instance, France and UK bombed Egypt in 1956. That was the so-called Suez Crisis. That's illegal. You can't do it. It's totally illegal. It's not just a little bit illegal. It's really illegal. And when the Security Council was talking about it, they just, issued a veto, so they couldn't be punished. Or when the UK and the US bombed Iraq in 2003, they should have been punished by the Security Council, but they were not because they issued a veto. And that's the thing that Saddam Hussein was not thinking about when he was invading Kuwait. He didn't think that he doesn't sit in the Security Council. That's the big game changer. So the UN Charter actually bans the use of force. That's my third, key take-home message I want to leave with you. And I want to show you that in some specific cases, the fight for the oil was taken to a secret level. And here we can turn to Iran. Iran was the country where the oil of the Middle East was first discovered in 1908. So it's only about 100 years ago that we have discovered oil in the Middle East. There was, oil was being pumped in the US already 50 years earlier, but the Middle East, only at that time, really became historically very, very important after the discovery of oil in the Persian Gulf. And then this, is a gusher. So, they were searching for a long time. BP, British Petroleum, and then suddenly found that oil, and they were very happy about it. And the Iranians, they got some money, but the British used the oil to actually change their whole military. They changed the fleet from coal to oil. Huge change, historically and strategically speaking. And then in 1953, this Iranian prime minister, democratically elected, said, okay, we want to have this oil for us. We are Iranians, we want the oil. And BP was not amused, okay? They said, come on, now the Iranians want the oil for themselves, that's not good. And Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry. Okay, that was a huge, huge moment in the history of the Middle East. And what the CIA and the MI6 did, they overthrew him. Okay, they just overthrew him. Is this legal? Of course not. You cannot go in another country and overthrow the government. You cannot do it. It's not just a little bit, illegal. It's totally illegal. It's like massively illegal. And what we see is that they used the Secret Service. So the American Secret Service is called CIA, you obviously know it, and the British Secret Service is called MI6, and you obviously know it. But the thing is, if we think about the MI6, okay, we don't think of the overthrow, the illegal overthrow of the government of Iran. Usually, I'm not sure about your country, but I'm just talking about people in Switzerland. The average Swiss, if he hears the word MI6, thinks James Bond. I'm not sure what the same thing. I'm just giving you an example. The average Swiss is just sitting on his couch, with his chips here and his beer, and he's watching a movie. So he's watching James Bond. And he just sees James Bond is one heck of a guy, okay? He jumps into a helicopter he's never seen with, lots of different instruments. He just flies away. Okay, Swiss is impressed. Eats a little bit more chips. James Bond jumps into an airplane, a military jet he's never seen before. He just flies it away, no problem. Or furthermore, he sees 50 men with machine guns that fire several shots a second. 50 men attack James Bond with machine guns. I think of 50 men having machine guns, and every gun fires several shots a second. For every human being, that's a problem. Not for James Bond, okay? He kills them all. Have you noticed that? He kills them all. And you don't think that is very contradictory. You just think, yeah, he's well trained. And then you know, there's this strong guy, this sort of, you know, muscle guy, and he, you know, takes James Bond and throws him across the table. Table breaks, but James Bond gets back in action, and in the end, James Bond wins. And he's always cool, right? And then he, you know, climbs across a little wall, and there's the most beautiful woman waiting for him. So the average Swiss, and probably it's the same in your country, goes, takes another chip, and says, he's a little bit like me, you know? You know, especially, it doesn't work for women, but men, you know, men identify with James Bond. Obviously, men are realistic. They say, he's like me if I have more time for training. Right now, right now, I don't have any time for my training. You know, I'm busy, I'm at school, or I'm at university, or just became a father, I have to look after the kids, or I'm successful in my company, so I can't do all these, you know, fighting stuff. But if I have more time, you know, we'd be very similar. So what I wanted to say you is that the MI6, the real MI6, is not James Bond. The real MI6 overthrew the government of Iran, and that, you know, has destroyed this democracy in Iran. Obviously, the Iranian noticed. Okay, they wrote "Yankees Go Home." I've described this in more detail in my book "Illegal Wars," but it's only in German right now. It might be an English translation later. But what I want to say is, "Yankees Go Home" is the Iranians didn't appreciate. Okay, they didn't appreciate the secret war against Iran. And that was the time, I'm saying this for the younger people in the room, that was the time where there was no Facebook, okay? So if you wanted to post something, you actually had to write it on the wall. Long time ago. American Foreign Secretary Madeleine Albright apologized. She apologized, but that was 50 years later, in the year 2000. She said, the Eisenhower administration, this President Eisenhower, was president in the United States, believed its actions were justified for a strategic reason. A strategic reason basically means resources or imperial dominance. You know, the Soviets, us, let's see who controls what country. But the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development. She could have said, but the coup was clearly a violation of the United Nations Charter. She didn't say that. And it's easy to see now why many Iranians continue to resent this intervention by America in their international affairs. So what I wanted to say is, if people tell you all these wars in the Middle East are to promote democracy, the facts don't support that theory, okay? In fact, democracy is being destroyed if democratically elected leaders in the Middle East nationalize the oil, okay? Then there's no respect for democracy whatsoever. Let's go to Vietnam. Why do I take Vietnam? First of all, because the Vietnam War had no legal basis, so it was an illegal war. And secondly, because it had nothing to do with oil. Okay, because some people come and say, okay, then all wars have to do with oil. No, that's not the case. But here again, you have an American president who attacks a country, this time Johnson. And we go back, that's our job as historians, we go back to the original quotes. What did he say when? He said that in 1964, in August, he went on television and said to his American citizens, my fellow Americans, as president and commander-in-chief, it is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships in the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is a bit of water off the coast of Vietnam. Have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply. So what is the president saying? He's saying to his citizens that he's just acting in self-defense. So your average American is there watching TV, he's going, oh, we were attacked. Where's that? Vietnam? Is that in Europe? So he's like, you know, people don't actually know what the president is talking about. They don't know. They've never heard of that country. And then they think, oh, okay, we were attacked. We have to defend. And then, you know, the war comes and we have like, from 1964 to 1975, we have 11 years of Vietnam War, with more than 3 million people killed. So it's a huge disaster. We're not talking about small things. And then the historians come, like me. So I have to apologize. We're always very late. But when we come, we often find out that it was a lie. There was no attack. The United States was not attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. And how do we know? First, we look at the newspapers from the time. So that's August 5, 1964. The newspaper usually just write what the president says. Okay, they don't check the facts. They just say the president said this, so it must be the truth, which is very, you know, I don't know why they do that all the way, but they say, North Vietnam attack US destroyer. A destroyer is just a ship of the US Navy. And that is actually the ship. Then we check which ship, because every ship has a name. So this ship is the Maddox. And then we check, okay, so the Maddox was attacked, and then, is that true? Was there really such an attack? What happened exactly? And then we go into the details. And you will find out that Vietnam is not an oil country, okay? But it was attacked by the United States. And what I want to explain is that not all wars are for oil. Some wars are for imperial dominance, okay? If you try to control other countries, it's just your interest to be the most strong, powerful nation. In 2005, we found out that historical data confirms that the Maddox, that's this ship, American ship, fired at North Vietnamese torpedo boats on August 2, and they returned the fire, leaving one bullet in the Maddox. So on August 2, yes, there was an exchange of fire, but the Maddox fired first, and the torpedo boats, you have to imagine, are just small boats. So, there was a little, that's not a war, okay? That's not a war yet. You don't have to start a war on that one. You can say, okay, we were in contact, but that was it. North Vietnamese, obviously, at that time, communist, South Vietnamese, supported by the Americans. And then President Johnson claimed that there was a second attack. He said, renewed hostile action. He said there was a second attack. And obviously, we go back to the data. We're talking about August 2, and then we go about August 4. And the second is signals intelligence. Okay? You can intercept the data when a commander on a ship sends a phone call. That's signals intelligence. Just communication, basically. And the SIGINT shows, according to Hancock was the American historian who looked at it. He was at the National Security Agency, NSA, which is the spy agency, which collects data on Angela Merkel and everybody. But that's at the time, they were writing their own history about the Tonkin affair. And he says that a second attack on August 4 by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on US ship did not occur. It did not occur. Okay, this is very important. It did not occur despite claims to the contrary by the Johnson administration. The quote is, the overwhelming body of reports, if used, would have told the story that no attack occurred. This was declassified by the National Security Archive in Washington, but only in 2005. So that's long after the war started. What we are left with is the Vietnam War. But it was based on a lie. So as historians, and that's maybe different to you guys, we always, when a war starts, search for the lie. It's not the exception, it's the rule. It's called the deception, okay? You have to usually deceive people to bring them into a war. So point number 5 was really just to say the Vietnam War was an illegal war, and it was a point to make that not all wars are based on oil and gas wars. Let me now turn to Russia. It's not that only the United States or only the United Kingdom attack other countries and violate the UN Charter. It's other countries, like Russia. Obviously, if you think about Russia, and here again, no offense to any Russians in the room, and no offense to any Americans in the room when I talk about America. It's not the point that historians want to insult any nation. We never want to do that. But we want to show you that sometimes even your own government is engaging in illegal wars, above all, if you're a member of the UN Security Council with veto power. If we think about Russia, most people think about Moscow or they think about the Kremlin. And if we go back in history, we know that on the 20th of August 1968, Russia sent tanks into Czechoslovakia. For those who are not, I know some people here are from Eastern Europe, so they know the story firsthand. But others who maybe are from France or Singapore don't know the story. At that time, Czechoslovakia was trying to implement political reforms. Moscow didn't want that. So they sent tanks in, and we had some 100 people killed. So that's not a war. It's not a war. If it's just 100 people, that's not a war. But it shows you that this is an illegal intervention into another state. But the Russians said, this is not a sovereign country. This is part of the Warsaw Pact. And, we say what we do here. And that was the so-called Cold War. But I collect it as data for illegal wars, because here we have a case where the UN Charter is violated. Now, the question is, of course, was the US criticized? Were they punished for the invasion of Vietnam? No, because they have a veto power in the Security Council. Were the Russians punished for invading Czechoslovakia? No, because they have a veto power. Okay. Had it been otherwise, had Vietnam attacked the US, obviously the Security Council would have punished them. So that's a dysfunctional structure in UN. Russia also attacked Afghanistan. They're not allowed to do that, okay? You can't send troops or bombers into a different country. You're not allowed to do it. And that was in 79, Christmas Day, December. The Russians invaded Afghanistan. Here, the war ended only in 1988. That was a real war. We have 1 million people killed, of which 15,000 Russians. And maybe if you recall the history, then the CIA supplied the Mujahideen, flew them in from Afghanistan, trained Osama bin Laden, and you have Al-Qaeda. So, it's a huge mess. And we shouldn't do it. That's the bottom line, okay? We shouldn't have illegal wars because they usually lead to more complicated structures. And now if people talk about Russia today, they talk about Putin, okay? And we have Putin in the Swiss press, in the German press, in the US press all the time. And much of the criticism, if we look at it detailed, is today about the Ukraine, okay? People ask me, is the war in Ukraine, is this an illegal war again? And I look at it step by step. It's difficult to say, because what we know is that in March 2014, Putin signed a document which led to the secession of the Crimea. For those who are not familiar with the map of the Ukraine, you have the Ukraine, and there's a peninsula to the south of it. And this peninsula has been cut off and is now part of Russia. So commentators in the German newspapers and the Swiss newspapers said, this is an illegal war, Putin got up one morning and he said, I don't know what to do. Well, let's attack and take over the Crimea. But that's not how it was. Okay, that's not how it was. If you look at the data very clearly, you see that you actually have an expansion of NATO after the end of the Cold War. And then NATO countries, hard to say which country, also tried to take in Ukraine. So you have a change of government in Ukraine in February 2014. And Putin would have lost his naval base in Sevastopol. He didn't want that, so there was a secession. You have more details in my book, but the Ukraine conflict is first you have a military coup, or you have a coup, and then you have the secession of the Crimea. And the Russians, if you read the Russian papers, or if you read Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, then they say the CIA overthrew the government first in Ukraine and brought in a new government. That's very delicate, but that's something we're working on. Here's a picture for you. That's the Crimea. And during the Cold War, obviously, this was all the Soviet Union. And these were the Warsaw Pact countries, so that's Czechoslovakia. That's where the Russians invaded. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, this part became Ukraine. And here, this part, the Russians now retook. And this is a marine base for the Russian Navy, which is ice-free. They have a lot of marine bases up there, but it's all in the ice, which is not very practical. Now let me turn to 9/11. I have 9/11 in the beginning of my talk. 9/11 is the abbreviation for the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. And the terrorist attacks of September 11 are for all of us something which we remember. Okay, that is contemporary history. Can I just maybe have a show of hands of those people who recall where they were on that day? Let me just check. So that's almost 100%. So if people recall where they were, okay, some say I was at work, or I was in the garden, I was visiting my mother, or I was traveling, I was having a holiday in Egypt. If they recall where they were on that specific day, then that means for a historian like me that it has left a very, very strong impression. May I ask you who in the room recalls where he was on August 8, 2008? That's when the war in Georgia started. 888. It's the simplest historical date you can actually imagine. But nobody recalls, right? So one person, thank you. Two persons, okay. Very attentive people, but the average citizen doesn't recall where they were on that day. But on 9/11, and that's data across many countries. I've given talks in Switzerland, Germany, Austria. 9/11 has left a mark in us. We recall it. And what usually people from that day recall is that they were in shock. These are the people in New York. They were in shock. Okay, so 9/11 is basically a shock for everybody. People say, no, I was not shocked. Yes, probably you were. Otherwise, you wouldn't even remember where you were. So very, very strong emotional impression. And what people then, as the main story, recall is that this is Manhattan, okay, a part of Manhattan. So New York, US, New York, Manhattan. And they recall that these are the Twin Towers, and they were hit by planes. So you have a plane, and then the towers collapse. And that, for most human beings, is 9/11. That's how they recall it. And as historian, we go back to the data. We know it's very delicate data, and we have to find out what really happened on that day. So the first thing we do is, how many towers did go down in New York? And what we now know is that the third tower, World Trade Center 7, also went down on the same day, but it was not hit by a plane. Okay? So we have 3 towers that go down, but we only have 2 planes. This is a sequence of pictures of that third tower that went down. I don't know how much detailed knowledge you have about 9/11. So I maybe have to ask you, how many people in the room were not aware that 3 towers went down? Just a show of hands that I know. Okay. And who was aware that 3 towers went down? Okay, it's 50-50. Okay. I'm not, going to split this according to nations, but it's just the basic knowledge that you need to have about 9/11 is that it was 3 towers that went down. And then the second thing as a historian is that we have to find out the reason why they go down. And the classic reason is the towers went down because they were hit by the planes. That's the classic reason. And here the problems start because the third tower was not hit by a plane. So it has to be another reason, why it goes down. And then I was teaching at Zurich University in Switzerland, a course for the history students. The history students are 20 to 25 years old, and they're obviously very interested to find out what happened on 9/11. So we first waited a few years, okay? Historians always wait a few years and see how things develop. And then we took the 9/11 Commission report, which is a 600 pages thick book, published by the American government, by Bush, if you want. And Bush put his hand on it and said, that's the truth about 9/11. So, we immediately flipped through the pages, and you can also find it as a PDF on the internet today, and do a search, a digital search. Enter WTC7. And you will find that the building World Trade Center 7 is mentioned in the report a few times, but it's not mentioned that it collapsed. And that is a huge problem for historians, okay? The number of buildings that collapsed is not correct in this report. And that's, the basis for the Bundeswehr, which is the German army, that they are in Afghanistan. So we're now faced with the story of, okay, the number of buildings is not correct, and we are in this so-called war on terrorism. What is it? What is the war on terrorism? It's very delicate, and I just have to remind you that in New York, obviously, you have a lot of tall buildings, but I'm from Switzerland. We don't have many tall buildings. The tallest building in Switzerland is in Basel, and it's called the Roche Tower. Roche is a pharmaceutical company, some of you might know. And it's the tallest building is roughly 178 meters. Now, World Trade Center 7 obviously was in the midst of Manhattan, where you have a lot of tall buildings, and it's 186 meter high. So in Switzerland, World Trade Center 7 would have been the tallest building. Had it come down, people would make a huge investigation. Everybody would know it. But in New York, it's like a tree in a big forest. It falls, people don't realize. And what we then see is that, okay, it fell on 9/11. This is before, and this is after. And it really fell into its own footprint. It totally collapsed, and part of it was free fall. So we have, and this is a very serious debate, is did it collapse due to fires or controlled demolition? Okay. That's a very delicate question, because if it fell due to controlled demolition, we don't understand 9/11. We don't understand it. If it fell due to fire, okay, then you can say, okay, the fire was induced by debris which fell down from the Twin Towers. So this is what historians right now look at. Maybe just give you more details on 9/11. What we now know is Chapter 7, the World Trade Center 7 collapsed on that day. And then we look at architects and engineers in the United States. They are leading the investigation into the collapse of World Trade Center 7. There are some 2,750 architects. Now you wonder, Why are the architects so interested into this building? Because architects build these buildings, and they say they should not collapse. Okay, that's why they're very interested. And this guy is called Richard Gage, and he created a foundation which is called Architects, Engineers 9/11 Truth in 2006. So it's 5 years after 9/11. You have what you call an investigative movement in the United States to look into this. Because he realized, that in this report, sorry to go back, World Trade Center 7 is not even mentioned. So he quickly realized, we're talking about basic scientific data. We need more clarity. And he says, we want a truly independent investigation because government agency investigation into the collapse of World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7 have not addressed massive evidence for explosive demolition. So what architects and engineers want to know is, were these buildings destroyed by controlled demolition? That's the question they put forward. And how do they do it? They go into the streets, okay, and try to inform the American public, okay, that 3 buildings went down. Because in the US, many people, like here in the room, probably 50%, think 2 buildings. So, they drive around. Did you know a 3rd tower fell? That is in San Diego, 2013. And I don't actually know what these people then think. They look at it and go like, oh, gee, that's a strange car. And then they read, did you know a 3rd tower fell on 9/11? And it says, building 7, not hit by a plane, collapsed in free fall 7 hours after the Twin Towers. And here you have architects and engineers. So they try to educate the public, and they're not able to go on television, okay? Television, Fox News, CNN, or the New York Times, or Washington Post, they don't bring that question, so they're trying to use the internet, or they drive around with a funny car. And as a historian, that's obviously interesting. Okay, we see that, we notice it, and it shows you that there is a debate. Then they publish in the European Physics News Journal in 2016 on the physics of high-rise buildings. So they try to go the way of science. And they say the building had free fall for 2.25 seconds. And that, for a historian, is very, very interesting. If you have a building which for part of its collapse is in free fall, 2.5 seconds, then there is no resistance. If you have no resistance, you have free fall. If you have some resistance, you don't have free fall. So this free fall thing, for a bit more than 2 seconds, is being debated now among physicists, among historians, among political science, and everybody goes like, why free fall? What's going on? How could that building move from stable, where you will walk in, work, eat, whatever, to free fall? Okay, that's a huge change for a building. This building, for instance, we just generally expect that it will not go into free fall in the next seconds, okay? We just assume that it will not do that. And usually buildings don't. And I then watch, how is this story being debated across the world? Because it's a global story. Okay? The war on terrorism is a global story. So World Trade Center 7 is a global story. And I assume you, every now and again, you're on the internet, and maybe you've surfed on this website. It's a Japanese website. It's a parliamentarian who's called Fushita. And he brought this question into the Japanese parliament in 2008. So that's 2 years after architects and engineers were created. And he said, look at that. There's a building which was not mentioned at the time. And it collapsed. So I don't know what the Japanese audience then thought, but they were thinking about it. Okay? Because always keep in mind that the Japanese in World War II ran out of oil completely. So fight for terrorism, fight for oil. That's an issue they look at closely. They had kamikaze at the end of World War II. Some of you remember the term. Kamikaze means if you have a plane, but you don't have enough fuel, so you just give it a one-way load. Now, we have in America a group which is called NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, and this NIST claims that fire destroyed the building. And I want to go into some detail. First, you need to know that the NIST is a governmental agency, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, it's called, and it's part of the Department of Commerce. Now, the Department of Commerce is part of the US administration, and in 2008, the NIST published a report saying fire brought World Trade Center 7 down. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. We don't know. We just, take their paper. But you must realize that Bush, President Bush, is also the boss of the NIST. Okay, because he's the president, And as the president, he heads the whole administration, including the Department of Commerce. It's part of the executive. And it came out in 2008. Simon Sander, in August 2008, said, we looked at it, and we found out that the building collapsed. So that's no debate, okay? It's true, the building collapsed. Everybody around the world agrees. But whether it collapsed due to controlled demolition or whether it collapsed due to fire, that's the issue is being debated. And it's, you know, some people say, well, that's just a detail. How could I care? No, no. That's the beginning of the war on terrorism. And the war on terrorism is going on tomorrow as well. It will go on next year. So we better think about it, how it all started. And we can confirm that there were fires, but you see there were rather small fires. Okay, there were fires in the building, but you know, architects and engineers say these fires were very small. The NIST claims that this column here, column 79, was just, you know, lost strength, and that's why the building collapsed. Specifically, they say you have here a girder. See, these very strong things here are called girders, and they say the heat of the fire made this girder expand, which is true. You know, something expands if you heat it, and then it jumped off that seat. That's what the NIST says, and that destroyed the entire building. That's the story, how the NIST tells it. And at the time, this story was presented in the New York Times. Here, of August 2008, New York Times says, these beams expanded, these are the beams, and then they pushed the girder off its seat, okay? That's the story. The fires were not hot enough to cause the steel to lose strength, but the heat expanded beams. Then you have a substantial expansion, and they distorted the girder so that it came loose from column 79. That's the key of the whole 9/11 story. Okay, we're now very, very close to the innest debate. We're talking about column 79 of World Trade Center 7. That's a detail, but that's what it all turns around. The displaced girder, that's still the New York Times. You can trust the New York Times, or you say that's just lies, but just take that in. The displaced girder caused the 13th floor to the west of column 79 to collapse onto the 12th floor. So that's the 13th floor. And it came down and it crushed on the other floor, and that's how the building came down. That's how they say. Now, already in 2006, I was looking at World Trade Center 7, and I talked to architects in Switzerland. And they told me World Trade Center 7 has probably been brought down by controlled demolition. So they say, no, it can't go down if a beam expands. It's not possible. And this is Jörg Schneider. I talked to him, and he said, I have to go back quickly, sorry. He said, if you look at the building, how it comes down, it has a symmetrical free fall. And you can't have a symmetrical free fall if just one column loses strength. That's his argument. So if we go into this detail, and it's important to look at this detail, then a Swiss architect, expert for building safety, tells me the NIST is not telling the truth. And that's complicated for the historian, okay? He says, controlled demolition. I published this in the Swiss newspaper. There was a huge roar, you know, big problem in Switzerland at the time. But just look at the construction. It was a steel building. And he says, if one column is being destroyed, that would not lead to the total collapse in free fall. And he says free fall, in order to happen, means that all columns have to go away at the same second. And you can only have that through controlled demolition. And if you look at World Trade Center 7, and I'm really interested in these details, you have 81 steel columns. And the NIST says column 79 was removed by fire. That's why you have free fall. And my Swiss expert, and I didn't just walk along the street in Switzerland and said, hey, what do you think about World Trade Center 7? No, I searched for the best experts. In fact, I checked for 2, and they both said that's controlled demolition. But that's not what the official history says, right? So I said, we don't have controlled demolition on 9/11. And then they say, well, you're the historian. That's your problem. So we now have to find out what happened. So the question really is, do you trust Simon Sander? Okay? It's a personal thing. Do you trust the man? He's written history on World Trade Center 7. He says it's fire, and you can either trust him or don't. The interesting thing now is that we have other people who work in the NIST, and they say there's something wrong. This guy is a whistleblower, he's a mathematician, and he also worked in the NIST. He didn't work on the World Trade Center 7, but he looked at the data, and if you look at these people, they're so-called brainies, okay? They're all brainies, they get top degrees, they can do math, and they're into this. And his name is Peter Ketchum, and he came forward now this year. So he's a so-called whistleblower. He says there's something very wrong with the NIST report and don't believe it. That's his message. What he said is, a few months ago, I began to read some of the NIST reports. I mean, nobody reads these reports, right? We historians read them, but most people are busy working, right? They're not reading these reports. I quickly became furious. First, about myself. How could I have worked at NIST and not noticed this before? Second, I was furious with NIST. I don't know what it is, but in the investigation on World Trade Center, something went totally wrong. Nothing adds up. The truth is where our healing lies. He's American, okay? He's American, and he says the NIST story on World Trade Center 7 is not credible. And he's being supported by architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. So really, if you look at the NIST, you can either trust this man, Sander, or Ketchum. And my tendency is to trust him. He's taking a lot of risks to say what he's saying, but I think he's a man who's searching for the truth, and I think we have to know the truth about 9/11. And they don't say the same thing, right? That's very important. He says fire, he says there's something wrong. And then we look at the firemen. Firemen were there on 9/11, and we look what they say. This is one guy, he's called Rudy Dent. He served 30 years in the fire department in New York. He says, I saw how World Trade Center came down. So there's no debate whether it came down. It came down, that's for sure. I was there. There was a loud explosion. Now that's interesting for historians, because if it was controlled demolition, you have a bang before it collapses. This was a classical controlled demolition. There's no question about that. So his position is very clear. He says controlled demolition. I'm not saying what it is. I'm just bringing you the story. I'm saying it's either controlled demolition or fire. And you have to go through the data and think for yourself. The explanation with the fire is ridiculous, so he doesn't believe it. Never in the history of high-rise skyscrapers has a fire brought down a skyscraper, and that's one of the big problems. On one day you have it 3 times, and before you don't have it. And the fire workers who went into the buildings expected the buildings to survive. So they were very surprised, and he lost 343 brothers. He calls them brothers. That's fellow firefighters. And if you think how firefighters work, they go into the building together as a unit, and they come out of the building together. They don't say, oh, it's 5 o'clock, let's have a break. Where's Johnny? Oh, I don't know, on the 13th floor. No. The firemen don't work like that. They know that they mutually depend on each other. It's very much like the military. The military also know that alone you can't survive. You work in your unit and you defend everybody else because they will defend you. But the firemen, they're there to save people, right? And they know that they have to cooperate. And he doesn't trust the story with the NIST. He says, we lost 343 firemen on that day. We in the fire department are like a family. I want the rest of the world to wake up that this was a false flag operation. A false flag operation means that we were lied to. I'm not saying it was a false flag operation. I'm saying let's think again about 9/11. Let's research World Trade Center 7 seriously. I'm now retired, so I can speak openly. NIST lied to the public. So this debate is very, very serious, and it's now being led, the NIST debate, by Leroy Halsey. Okay, he's a Canadian. He's an American professor at University of Fairbanks in Alaska. Okay, he's modeled the whole World Trade Center 7 collapse, and he's come to the conclusion that fire could not have brought the building down. So if you're interested in that, Leroy Halsey is the man to turn to. He's the leading expert right now. So back in Switzerland, this all left me very confused. Okay, I was looking at the data and I was going, what do we hear on Swiss television? On Swiss television, we just hear 2 towers collapsed. We didn't hear anything about the 3rd tower. Nothing. And then, it said, now the war on terrorism started and, America attacked Afghanistan. Why? Okay, because bin Laden is there. It's very confusing, isn't it? And then I checked different TV stations, and I checked the BBC, because the BBC, you know, is a very respected TV station. Many people say it's the best TV station in the world. So I checked, did they report the collapse of the third tower? And the good news is, yes, they did. But the bad news is, too early, okay? They reported, yeah, you're laughing, but it's not a detail for me. They reported the collapse at 5 o'clock, but the building collapsed at 5:20. And that's not good, okay? You should not report something before it happened. That's really bizarre, you know, this whole 9/11 thing. Once you dig deep, it becomes very strange. Jane Stanley was the journalist. She was standing in front, and she said, at the 5 o'clock news, she said the 47-story Salomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. The Salomon Brothers building is World Trade Center 7. But at that time, the building is standing behind her. So that's fake news. It doesn't say that on TV, right? I put that in. Fake news. Somebody said, but it's only fake. It was only fake news for 20 minutes. But yeah, it was 20 minutes fake news. So we waited how BBC would react. So researchers approached BBC. In 2002, BBC didn't react. 2003, people said, hey, come on, why did you report this to her? BBC didn't react. 2004, people were writing emails like, why did you report this too early? BBC said, we're not going to comment. People went, in 2005, people got a little bit angry and said, come on, you can't do this. I mean, you know, news are supposed to be fast. 2006, they reported. And in 2008, she had to take a stand. Okay? And she said, it was a mistake. She said, I was thrown, not a question, but a statement of fact. I don't know where that came from. So really what she does is she's reading out from a teleprompter. Okay, so I know how journalists work. She didn't do the research. She was just there doing live reporting, meaning reading out of a prompter. So the question is, how did it end up on that prompter? How did these people know? And then Richard Porter, the head of BBC World News, says, we were working on an incorrect news agency report. We had the statement from Reuters. Okay, that doesn't make it much better, because Reuters is one of the biggest news agencies of the world. If they get it wrong, something is seriously wrong. That came out in 2008, so BBC had to apologize. Most people at the time were not interested in 9/11 anymore. Only historians like me, you know, we go through the details and say, okay, Jane Stanley, how is she doing today? Let's search for her. What is she doing? So this 9/11 story is complicated. I just, you know, want to give it to you that if you reflect upon 9/11 at all, focus on World Trade Center 7, and there focus on the question whether it's been destroyed by fire or by controlled demolition. I'm not taking a stand, okay? I'm just bringing you the debate. Maybe this evening, when you go out and eat together, you can talk about it. I hope I don't spoil the evening, but it's one of those questions that people sometimes debate. We know that the term oil wars doesn't, you know, show up very often. It just doesn't. People talk about terrorism. Oil wars is not a topic. And specifically, as historians, we look, how was the war against Iraq sold to the general public, meaning the public in the US, but also a global audience? There we have the German foreign minister Joschka Fischer. He once said the region of the Persian Gulf will remain the gas station of the world economy. That's true, okay? The oil and the gas is there. That's a fact. And then I go like, okay, but if you do a false flag, then you have to actually link the Muslims to 9/11, because otherwise you can't then get the oil which is in the Muslim world, okay? So I go, how did they link the Muslims to 9/11? Could you actually see Osama bin Laden in one of the planes? No. Then people go, well, Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. That was Mohammed Atta and other guys. Then go, did you see Mohammed Atta waving out of it? No. You didn't see any Muslim on 9/11. Nothing at all. So how did the FBI close this story? They say, FBI discovered the passport of a Muslim, Satam al-Suqami, one of the terrorists aboard American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. So they say they found the passport. When did they find it? On the 16th of September 2001. That's 5 days after attack. At that moment, we were still shocked. We were all shocked. They could tell us whatever. We were like, you found the passport? Okay, yeah. What else? You know, they tell you anything, you just take it in. But with a few years distance, you go back and say, wait a moment, where did they find this passport? Here. I'm not kidding. That's what they're saying. They say the guy was in the plane hit the tower, the plane is gone, the passport was found. Now, I'm a historian. I'm just a historian from Switzerland. Was I there? No, I was in Switzerland. Did I find the passport? No. Did you find the passport? No. Is it true that the FBI found the passport? We don't know. But it's one of these questions. And as historians, we come forward and say, gee, they found the passport. Did they find the black boxes? What is a black box? A black box is this thing. Every plane has two, okay? But the official report says the 4 black boxes, the voice and flight data recorder of flight AA11 and U175 that hit the Twin Towers were not found. So that's strange. They find the passport, but not the black boxes. You think it's funny, but for me it's really complicated, okay? I have to write the history for your kids, okay? Should I write into the books on 9/11, 3 towers collapsed in New York because they were hit by 2 planes? Or should I write on 9/11, 3 towers were blown up by controlled demolition and we didn't dare to talk about it? What should I write? What should I write? For my kids, for you kids, what should we write? It's extremely rare that we don't get the recorders back. I can't recall another domestic case in which we did not receive the recorder, says Ted Lopatkiewicz, who's the spokesman for the National Transport and Safety Board. So usually you find the recorder, because that's important to reconstruct the history of the planes who hit the Twin Towers. In this case, we didn't find the recorders. Why? People say because it was such a huge damage. But why then did they find the passport? I don't know. Either you trust that story or you don't. What we know is that quite a few Americans now come forward and say, I don't trust the story anymore. I don't. This guy is called Robert Kennedy Jr., and he says, let's face it, what we call the war on terror is really just another oil war. I think that's a very interesting observation. Robert Kennedy Jr. is the son of Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was the brother of John F. Kennedy. Most of you know that John F. Kennedy was the president in the United States, and he was shot in 1963. His brother was with him in the administration, and later wanted to become president, almost made it, was very close to becoming president. He was shot as well. And he's the son, okay? So he knows a lot about politics. And he says, no, forget it. I don't believe in the war on terrorism. And I personally don't believe in the war on terrorism either. I say, yes, we do have Muslim terrorists. Yes, it's true. But we also have Christian terrorists. When the IRA people blew themselves up in Northern Ireland, I didn't, think that every Christian is a terrorist. I mean, for that matter. So I think we have to look at oil wars. And we have to look, how did the American administration justify the attack on Iraq? They used fear to justify. President Bush at the time said, my fellow citizens, again, we work with original quotes in 2003, just before the attack on Iraq. My fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraq regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. The danger is clear. Using chemical, biological, or one-day nuclear weapons obtained with the help of Iraq, the terrorists could fulfill their stated ambitions and kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people in our country or another. So the story by Bush is terrorists will get weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein in Iraq and, create a nuclear 9/11. Then people are shocked and they go, okay, let's have this war. Vice President Dick Cheney at the time said, we have reason to believe that Saddam Hussein is building nuclear weapons. We now know all this is nonsense. There were no weapons of mass destruction. But the communication department of the White House linked weapons of mass destruction with terrorism, and because we were all shocked by terrorism, this had a huge impact. Colin Powell, Secretary of State, was in the United Nations and presented this as evidence. It's not evidence, okay? There were no weapons of mass destruction. He said we need to attack Iraq. No, it's illegal. You can't attack Iraq. It would have been illegal also if Saddam Hussein had attacked the United States in 2003. The UN Charter, as I told you before, forbids any country to bomb another country. The British, I know some are here from UK, from Scotland. How were the British fooled? Monsters Inc., this newspaper, The Sun, writes, The proof we needed, Saddam, here, does back bin Laden, here, and Al-Qaeda and poses a direct threat to Britain. The British still had 9/11 in their mind. So the newspapers linked Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, although they had nothing to do. Saddam Hussein has never supported Osama bin Laden, never. So that was just a lie. So what you get in the newspaper sometimes are flat lies. But when you read it, you have it in your mind. There's no chance that you say, I just read it a little bit, okay? No, no. If you read it, it's in your mind. You can bring it out again, but that takes an effort. In Germany, we have a newspaper which is called Bild. And the lie was, das sind Saddams Waffen, Chemiebomben, Giftflugzeuge, Biowaffen, Raketenbunker. So they just brought the story of Colin Powell and said, that's the truth. Today, we know it's fake news. Then American soldiers fighting in Iraq, that's for us very interesting. We want to find out, do they think they fight a fight for oil and gas? No. Do they fight a fight because they think the US is the imperial power and we have to, control the Middle East? No. They think Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11 and that's why they are in this war. That's what they say. Okay? And Powell says in 2005 that he feels terrible for having falsely presented Iraqi weapon program that turned out not to exist. And the one who presented it on behalf of the United States, and I will always be part of my record, that's painful. But at that time, the war had already started. So we have apologies, but they come a little late. And now we have 1 million people killed in Iraq. Okay? The Middle East is in huge turmoil, huge turmoil. And 1 million people killed is a lot. That's not just, I don't care. It's just happening within this framework of war on terrorism. That's why most people don't ask questions. And here is the proof for the US soldiers. They say in a research in 2006, 85% of US soldiers said their mission was to punish Saddam for his role in 9/11. Problem is, there was no role. So we really live in an age of confusion. Okay? American soldiers fighting in Iraq, thinking that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. It's very, very complicated. Very, very complicated. Very sad. And if you look at the countries that were bombed by Obama in 2016, President Obama, we'll see he bombed Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, without mandate by the UN Security Council. You can't do it. So why do people accept it? Really, because this is the frame, the war on terrorism. And as long as it's Muslim countries, people in Europe tend to say, well, just Muslim countries. I'm telling you, that's not a good idea. Because this law protects all countries. And it's not good to say, well, you can bomb a few as long as they're far away. It's not a good idea. We're almost, at the end. We're now at 12. We have 13 and 14 to go. Are you still with me? Are you still awake? Good. I'll wrap it up, okay? The question is now, is this going to go away? The overall picture of the world is that world population is going up. Okay, we're now 7.5 billion, and we go up at 80 million people every year. So that means the pressure on resources like water. We were talking a lot about water today, not in my talk. But in my talk, I was talking about oil and gas. So the pressure on these resources will continue. It's not going to go away because we're many people. Calculations say that we're now here at around 7.5 billion. We'll probably go up to 9.5 or 10 in the year 2050. Now, the year 2050 obviously is still 33 years away. And now many people say, I don't care what's happening in 33 years. But if I look at my kids, then it's not a theoretical question. This is in their lifetime. So I'm saying we must find a way to go away from the oil and gas wars and transition to a renewable energy structure. I'm fully convinced that we have to do it. I'm not saying if you put solar cells on your roof, the Iraq war is going to stop. It's more complicated than that. But I do believe in renewable structures, like other speakers who today have emphasized that we must go towards sustainable structures. And obviously, some people say the oil will not last forever. We now have decline in mature oil fields. Somebody has told me, Dr. Ganser, we're not going to bomb the Middle East anymore. We're going to take all the oil from the North Sea. And I said, okay, check the data. Have you looked at the decline in the North Sea? That's the North Sea. Okay. It's the only spot in Europe where we have any oil, if you leave Russia away. Okay. Russia is in Europe and in Asia. It's in 2 continents, biggest country of the world. But here, everything is in the North Sea. It's out in the water, so that's a platform in the North Sea. And as energy analysts, we go and check how much oil is there. Is it going up or is it going down? That's the questions we ask. And you look at the production of the Norwegians, and you see, in the year 2000, they reached some sort of a peak. They started in 1971. That's almost, I was born in 72. So they started producing the North Sea about the age that I have. I'm now 45. So it goes up, reaches the max, and then goes down. So oil production in Norway has been falling for more than 15 years. Can I just ask the room, because I'm not sure how familiar you are with oil and gas, who was aware that oil production is falling in the North Sea? A show of hands. Okay, that's maybe 30%. And the same is true in the UK. Okay, production went up. Here's a bump. That was an explosion of a platform. And here in the year 2000, the UK reaches a max and it has gone down. Recently, it went a little bit up, but it didn't go up to the maximum it once was. That's because oil prices have gone up. And if you look at new data like Bloomberg, okay, that's a story from 18th October 2017 with the Norwegian responsible for the oil production. So that's last month. And you go through the text, then you really have to search very carefully, and then you find crude output is now just half of the 2000 peak. And if you read quickly, as most of us do, you don't even realize, okay? But what it really means is peak was here, now we're half down. It was at 3 million barrels, is it now at 1.5 million barrels. And if you take that data all together for the world, people say, okay, how's it going to look in the details? This is UK production. And so you see the different oil fields, and you see with the year going by, the oil fields lose production. But the world population is going up. So we really have to choose whether we want to kill each other because of resources, or whether we want to transition to renewable energies. And I clearly have made my choice. I want to transition to renewable energies. Somebody said, I'm not interested in these details, okay? Can you make a simple chart of the oil age? And I said, yeah, easy, sure, here you go. That's the oil age, in perspective, okay? That's the year 0, 2,000 years ago. There's no oil, no gas, no coal, no nuclear. It was 100% renewable. We already had that, but it was not, it was not. There was no EasyJet, no YouTube, no Facebook. I mean, it was a different world. Then the Middle Ages, from 500 to 1500, 1,000 years of Middle Ages, no oil at all. In 1850, the oil age starts. We now have 160 years of oil age. We went up. We must find a way not to kill each other and build sustainable economies. We can do it. We can do it. It's possible. If we take the money and instead of, building arms, build renewable structures. It's possible. So the oil decline in the North Sea since the year 2000 is a fact, and it shows us that this is an issue. My vision is 100% renewable energy. This is a picture taken on my house. I sat on it and I, took away the tiles and put on photovoltaics on my roof. I don't know, does anybody of you have renewable power production on their house, photovoltaics? Anybody here? Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So, these people are becoming more and more widespread. They produce energy. They produce electricity that you don't only can use to, make light. I also use it for a heat pump, so I produce my heat with that electricity. But still, I have too much electricity. I have too much. So I found a good solution. I have an electric car. Okay, I'm one of these guys who strongly believes in electromobility. This is a Tesla, produced in America. So I really like these products. I don't like the bomb so much, but I like electricity, electric cars. You can actually, on your house, produce energy and power your car with it. I'm not sure, does anybody have an electric car even? No? There's one guy? 2 guys? Okay. We're very much in agreement on that one. We're going like, electric cars are interesting. Of course, you will find news that say, Tesla, when you produce such a car, it takes a lot of energy and it's better to drive a diesel car, it's better to drive a BMW on oil. make up your mind. I'm not telling you what is the final truth on the war on terror, on renewable energies, on electromobility, on world population. I'm just giving you my analysis and what I try to do about it. And obviously, we should respect the UN Charter and international law. Right now, we are on a very dangerous path. We have this phrase in our head, which is called the war on terrorism, and we just throw international law out of the window. And I'm, as a historian, telling you, why should we do that? We introduced international law at the end of the Second World War. Do we need a third world war, everybody bombing each other, to understand that we should have a new rule? What rule? That nobody should bomb the other one. We would come up with the same rule. There's no better one. There's no new one. So we basically have the choice to either have a more profound experience of suffering or already now say international law matters. No matter whether you're from Singapore or China or US or Israel or Switzerland or Sweden or Russia or, it's important for every country. I'm convinced of that. Furthermore, I'm very convinced that we have to be mindful. What does mindfulness actually say? It means that we have to be aware of what we're thinking and what we're feeling. So we have to observe our feelings and our thoughts. Because if we consume on television war propaganda and we're not mindful, it just enters our head and we believe it. Whereas if we're mindful, we observe and we say, what's that? What did he say? What did that cause as a feeling in myself? Do I want that? Do I believe that? And of course, you should be mindful also now when I conclude my talk. I'm not saying trust everything I said. I say, do your own research, check the data. And this guy, I think he's really interesting. This is an American who came forward and spoke out. And he's a mathematician, okay? I think he's much cleverer than Trump, okay? What he is saying is interesting. He says, the wounds of 9/11 have remained unhealed for too long, 16 years already. That's why truth is so important. We can't say, forget about truth, I don't want the details, let's just see how we get out of the mess. You have to have a very clear analysis first. But your feelings are not the truth. He says, on 9/11, above all, our feelings were steered. Your feelings are important and beautiful, but your feelings only tell you how you feel, not what is true. And I fully agree. I can't agree more. He's a very, very clever man. And as I talk to different people about 9/11 in America, about the official narrative, feelings often played a large part. What he wants to say is, it's very difficult to talk about World Trade Center 7 in the US. And that's the same in Europe. So please consider that your feelings are important and should be respected, but they're not the truth. The truth is where our healing lies. So we must have a scientific debate about 9/11 and about the whole war on terrorism. And now I wrap it up. I am absolutely convinced that everybody should do his own research and that he should take digital timeouts. What does that mean? That means that you sometimes go to walk out in the woods with no mobile phone, okay? With no smartphone. Because we usually have a lot of screens in front of our heads. Smartphone, computer, or television. So we have screens all the time and we think we're well informed. No, we're very, very strongly exposed to propaganda. And we can put it away and say, okay, what am I interested in? And then go and dig with a word for what you want to know. Because the digital revolution now gives you the opportunity, when you have a word, to dig it in, and there you can build up your knowledge easily. You couldn't do that 50 years ago, but now you can do it. I want to conclude with this picture. Shows the world. It's an original picture. And I want to stress that despite all the things that I've said, I think the world is a beautiful place. Okay? Don't get I was talking about terror, war, oil, population growth, but I'm very convinced that the world is a beautiful place. I'm also convinced that human beings are beautiful. I think that they have the power to learn and overcome if they have been, trapped in lies and brutality. Also, I think it's very interesting, they don't actually see countries. Okay? The countries that you see in the school book are colored, aren't they? Switzerland usually is red, and France is yellow, Germany is orange. But when you look at it, it would be hard to actually know where Switzerland is. Spain is easy, right? You cut it here, and cut a little bit of Portugal out. But countries are just a thought. That's it. And obviously, we can believe in these thoughts. That's a good idea. But then we should also believe in international law, because that's the other thought. And if we just believe in countries and leave away international law, we have nationalism. And human beings have killed themselves along nationalistic line far too often. So these are the 3 books that I've written. This one has been translated into English. The other one's, unfortunately, only in German. But I hope you find it interesting. I hope that from wherever you're coming from, whatever country you're from, you have an opportunity to talk about these issues. And I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.